regular Tuesday Crease Brownbag. Our speaker today has been keeping really quite busy this semester between all of the different things, the teaching and studies as well. But he's also been organizing a graduate student conference on Ukrainian studies called Platforma, and that's going to be happening this Saturday, the 22nd, from I think 10 o'clock is registration. You've got a schedule on a piece of
10
paper.
to 7:30 for drinks.
Exactly, yeah, that's the most important. So we've got a number of graduate students, some of them from here at KU and then from other universities and institutions as well. And then the keynote, Mark Hagen is coming in from Arizona State University, and his is going to be at, his keynote session is going to be at 6 o'clock. I think we had that wrong on our list of weekly events. But it's free and open to the general public. You're more than welcome to come in for all or part of it, and we'd love to see you there. It's over at the Forum in Marvin Hall, so it's a nice space as well. Anyway, our speaker today is Nathan Pickett. He is a PhD candidate in geography. I guess it's geography and atmospheric sciences now. But he has his MA in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies from here at KU, and then a BA in History from BYU. And his research interests include political geography, violence, very centered on our region of the world, and he's done quite a bit of work dealing with Ukraine and other countries of the former Soviet Union. So he's here today to talk about a special situation of a city in Ukraine. So,
thank you, Bart, and thanks everyone for coming today. So this topic of my talk today is based around one particular city in Ukraine, and it's part of my dissertation research in general, which is on the long-lasting political effects that Chernobyl has had on Ukraine. Internal politics, biopolitics, and geopolitics. And this aspect here with Slavutych is specifically focusing on some of the non-state-centered geopolitical connections that this city has been able to forge because of its Chernobyl connection, and sort of bypassing the Ukrainian state. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this situation here in this city. Last school year, I was on a Fulbright doing dissertation research in Ukraine, and this wasn't a city that I had planned on exploring or getting into, but by talking to people, it seemed like an interesting case, and I went and visited the city a few times, got to know a lot of the people there, both in the government and just normal people. It's a very small city, only about 25,000 people, and I found it to be a really interesting case for looking at how people relate to tragedy and how they're able to turn tragedy into something productive, and how to do that when you're not getting a lot of support from the state apparatus. But to start off with, let's find out where the city is a little bit. So this is a map of Ukraine. Only one. And where this pin is where the city of Slavutych is. This city was built in 1988 as the youngest city in the Soviet Union and the youngest city in Europe. And it is in the very north-central Ukraine, and it's about 50 kilometers from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The most direct route is by a train line that goes directly from Slavutych to Chernobyl that actually goes through Belarus. So there's interesting geopolitical things there too, but I won't really get into that because most people can't ride that train. You have to be a plant employee. And there's other restrictions there too, like because you're going through another country, there's passport and visa issues, all that kind of stuff. So the Chernobyl power plant was here, and after the disaster in 1986, a large area of Ukraine was sort of blocked off in the exclusion zone. It's gone through a number of different names, a number of different classifications, and although it doesn't really show up here on this map, it's about a 30-kilometer radius at its extent around Chernobyl, and it also goes into Belarus as well, here into the radioecological reserve. Slavutych is outside of the exclusion zone, and the way that the radioactive cloud over Chernobyl happened, or the direction it went, the wind was blowing from the east those days, and so the initial blast of radiation went off in the opposite direction. So the worst types of radiological contamination were in this area, in this direction. So like the Red Forest is down here. A large chunk of Belarus has been evacuated. But Slavutych is outside the zone, and that was a meaningful decision because this city was built in order to house plant workers. After the explosion in 1986, that was only one of the 4 reactors that was in operation. The other 3 were still going. And they went through various rounds of decommissioning and shutdown. And that actually forms a large part of the story of the city that I'll get into. This is what the city itself looks like. The bottom left is a Google Earth image. And at the top, or bottom right, sorry, in the top right is the plan of the city. It's very small. It takes about 15 minutes to walk diagonally across the entire city. Only 25,000 people, and it feels very small. It feels very close-knit. It feels very community-focused, even when you're just there visiting. So to start off with, I want to sort of give a little bit of context of why I was interested in it, how it fits into my dissertation. And so like I said before, I'm looking at this city specifically to investigate its geopolitical connections and the interplay between techno-scientific discourse and knowledge production and leveraging that expertise in order to forge some geopolitical connections with other states, with international organizations, charity groups, different NGOs. So really looking at how local policy and technological expertise inform each other and how that is manifest in geopolitical connections. So why this place? I kind of touched on that a little bit, but this is a very unique city in Ukraine and really in the entire post-Soviet space. Not just because it was built as a nuclear monotown. There are a number of those, but this was built specifically post-accident in order to still run the plant. So its history is a little different, and how it ends up coming to be is this very international cooperation. It was designed to be the pinnacle of Soviet planning and engineering, which I'll get into a little bit. And because of its makeup and its identity, part being explicitly tied to Chernobyl and part being explicitly international in its construction and its design, it's really uniquely situated to look at some of these issues that I was looking at, non-state geopolitical connections. And also I'm interested in looking at how critical geopolitics as a field, which does deal with non-state geopolitical connections, works in connection to this city. Critical geopolitics, for those unfamiliar with the term, is moving beyond a geopolitical view of the world where states are discrete actors with no sort of internal divisions or smaller groups, minority, anything. So looking at the world as just colored blocks on a map, critical geopolitics really gets in to try to deconstruct that, to look at other relationships that are happening, to look at specific individuals that are driving policy, and also how localities can influence how geopolitics is constructed in a place. So just a little bit of the overview of the history of the city. The city was built in 1988, sort of by central fiat from Moscow. People still needed to work at the plant. It was very expensive to bus people back and forth out of Kyiv to work there. It was, especially in the early years, very unsafe for people to live persistently in the zone. And even now, for people that work in the zone, usually you have a shift for 2 weeks inside the zone, then you leave for 2 weeks, then you come back and work for 2 weeks. And you're highly compensated because of the risk involved for radiological contamination. So they decided to build this city, and the way that they built it was intentionally to be sort of like the pinnacle of Soviet urban design, with an emphasis on green space, an emphasis on different communal identities. And so if you look back here on this map, it's divided into a number of different quarters. And each of these quarters is named after one of the 8 republics that contributed construction workers to build the city. So you have like a Kyiv quarter and a Baku and a Yerevan and a Tallinn quarter to really demonstrate that this is an all-federation sort of project, bringing in all of these republics. The architect of the city was Kyiv-based, but they brought in a lot of expertise from these other member republics of the Soviet Union. And at the very beginning of the city, it sort of operated as a nuclear monotown, as the model was for other cities of its type in the Soviet Union. But in 1995, there was something that really shook it up. Talking with people, especially officials and people that lived in the city since its construction, Ukrainian independence had almost no bearing on what happened in the city. Because the original mayor, who I'll talk about at length in a little bit, decided very early on that it would be very pro-Ukrainian, having Ukrainian language early education. Really the first city in Ukraine to really commit to that particular political agenda and being a Ukrainian first city. And it's also because it is a nuclear monotown built at the very end of the 20th century, it really had this forward-looking technological innovation angle as well, and that narrative comes up throughout its history. So in 1995, the G7 and the UN met with leaders of Ukraine to decide what they're going to do with the Chernobyl power plant, because the other reactors were still running, but the zone was still unsafe. There's still a lot of unknowns going on with nuclear contamination. So they were trying to figure out what are they going to do about this plant, and they decided that, so this cooperation between the G7, the UN, and Ukraine, that they need to decommission the plant altogether, to close all of the reactors. And in 1995, they signed this memorandum of agreement that stipulated that Ukraine will close or fully decommission the plant by the end of the year 2000. So this put a very heavy and sort of like ominous deadline on the city. This was accountable for an overwhelming majority of the employment in the city. And they were looking at about an 86–88% unemployment rate if the plant closed, if they weren't able to come up with other ideas. So this period between 1995 and 2000 is really critical in the development of the city and to figuring out what are we going to do. The city is going to die if we don't do something to compensate for the reactors being closed, for the plant to be decommissioned. And so a number of action plans were introduced in cooperation with the UN, and also importantly with groups like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, and a number of different NGOs to sort of figure out how are we going to keep the city alive? How are we going to employ people? How are we going to move businesses to this tiny town kind of in the middle of nowhere on the Belarusian border? On the other side, it's just forest. Near Chernihiv, but not really that close to Chernihiv, about an hour's bus ride away. So how are we going to save this city? There was a host of different ideas that were floated, kind of a scattergun approach. Throw everything at the wall, see what sticks. They established a special economic zone with the state so that businesses could start up there with minimal tax requirements to sort of like get a startup culture going, even though they didn't use those words at the time. And trying to bring in higher education into the city. And all of these measures were successful at varying levels. The special economic zone, for example, wasn't really that successful in attracting foreign investment, but a lot of that has to do with the bigger issues of the Ukrainian economy. In the late 90s, the Ukrainian economy was especially poor. And it's really hard to attract foreign investment into a country where you can't rely on the banks and there's little international support for bolstering the economic situation, which is why part of the memorandum of agreement was to provide financial aid to Ukraine and to parts of Ukraine specifically to help overcome this huge economic looming disaster that would be closing the plant. Not just economic, but also the Chernobyl power plant supplied a significant percentage of electricity to the capital, to Kyiv, and also to the surrounding area. So there was also other considerations of where are we going to get our energy. The energy crisis between Ukraine and Russia hadn't quite reached or hadn't quite come to a head at this period, but there was always sort of discussions of where are we going to get our energy from? How are we going to be energy sufficient? How is Ukraine as a country going to be self-sufficient? So this is sort of the context that this memorandum of agreement was written in. But the city still exists today and is actually one of the most thriving cities in Ukraine. And a lot of it has to do with individuals making decisions to specifically affect how the city was able to stay afloat, which I'll get into in a little bit. But since 2001, after the plant's closing, Slavutych is unique among Ukrainian cities in that the birth rate is actually positive, it's rising, whereas in the rest of Ukraine, the birth rate is dropping. And it was able to keep its unemployment low, and it was able to be economically pseudo-self-sufficient because it wasn't getting a whole lot of money from the state. As the economy was shrinking and people began to be less worried about the Chernobyl exclusion zone, more and more money got taken out of the liquidation efforts for the plant and for the exclusion zone. And a lot of that money was going to Slavutych because that's where the workers lived. So they were able to sort of leverage their expertise about nuclear power plants and forging these connections in order to get money donated in some instances, and also to get grants and other sort of working relationships with other nuclear cities around the world to sort of share expertise. Particularly after the Fukushima disaster, there was a number of Japanese delegations that came to Slavutych to see what they were doing in the city because it had rebounded and was kind of seen as this success story. So these Japanese delegations would come and to try and figure out what was going on in the city, so that to try and come up with a plan for Fukushima as well. Even though the contexts are very different there, they wanted to see what they could take out of this situation. Also, part of the story in this third section here since 2001 is the construction of the new Safe Confinement. So after the initial explosion at Chernobyl, they hastily built what they call the sarcophagus, poured a bunch of concrete over the reactor to stop it from continuing to spew radioactive material into the atmosphere because the core even now is still burning. That initial structure was supposed to last for 30 years, but even after 20, it was showing signs of degradation from weather and erosion, and also just the constant burning of the core sort of eating it out from within. And also part of the memorandum of agreement was to establish a new, better confinement structure for the fourth reactor. And I don't know if you guys are tuned into to Chernobyl news at all, but late last year in November, the new Safe Confinement was actually completed, which was an international project headed by a French company, but with a large EU involvement and EU money coming in to build this multi-million-dollar structure that basically is like an upside-down arc that was built on railroad tracks and then slid over the reactor to contain it. And that is supposed to last for 100 years. We'll see how that shakes out in about 50 years or so. And also, with this sort of recreation of the city, they weren't able to divorce themselves from this legacy of Chernobyl, nor did they actually want to. Instead, they co-opted this tragedy into a source of rebirth and regrowth for the city, into a positive. And the identity that the city's taken on says, yes, we're part of this national tragedy of the Chernobyl explosion, but it's not all a bad thing. We're not all doom and gloom about it. We were able to grow out of it. The air in Slavutych is particularly clean. There's not a whole lot of cars because there's not a whole lot of people. There's hardly any crime, and it's a very cozy feel. Part of that is part of the small population, but also that all of the people that have been living in the city came in the late 80s and have had children and have grown there, there hasn't been a whole lot of transplants to Slavutych because there's kind of no reason to if you're not connected to the plant or to the city. And so it has a real tight-knit, small-town feel to it. And that really has sort of helped its identity in, because Slavutych markets itself as a great place for families to live and to grow. There's a lot of early childhood education and development, lots of programs for kids. And it's kind of unique in that way among Ukrainian cities. So specifically getting into some of these geopolitical connections now. A lot of this comes down to this name right here, Volodymyr Janko, who was the first mayor of Slavutych and was the head person in the city council before they formed a mayorship. He was head of the city from 1988 to 2015. A really long tenure as being the guy in charge. And his personal involvement in the city and the care that he put into it really drove the development that the city experienced. And so I've met with Udovichenko a number of times, and he has this real infectious, bubbly personality. He's like the grandpa that you always wanted, you know. He's always there. He's always got something nice to say. He's very complimentary. And he loves to talk about himself and all his accomplishments. And, oh, yes, I went to school in Europe. And, oh, yes, I've written all these books about being a great mayor. And he's just a real great guy to talk to. And in talking with his successor, a guy named Yuri Fomichev, who was sort of handpicked by Udovichenko to lead the city after, well, abdicated is the wrong word, but after Udovichenko stepped down. Fomichev really, in talking with him, he's like, oh yeah, we can't ignore all the things that Udovichenko did for the city, because without him, the city would not exist. Udovichenko was the driving force behind getting all these connections with international organizations, with charities, with grants, with companies to invest in the city. It was really on his experience and on his guarantees that their money would be well invested, that it was worth investing in Slavutych, that it was for a good thing. He was really able to drive a lot of these particular connections. And one quote that Fomichev said about him is that even if you really don't like him, and there are a few people in the city that don't really like him, on just like personality-wise, you cannot say that without him, you would still be in the city. Like, there would be nothing in Slavutych without Udovichenko. And Udovichenko, some of the things that he did also in terms of just building the city, one of the most impressive things I think is that he established a youth city council and had representatives from each grade and school come and meet, and they meet monthly. And so they decided, like, what are we going to do to make the city better for you young people? Because really the effort was making it a city that was good for building families and for developing youth into productive citizens. And so they transformed part of the Central Park area that was kind of undeveloped into a skate park. And it's one of the very few skate parks in Ukraine because it's what the youth of that city wanted. Other things that he did is that every Monday, the city council would have an open doors policy where anyone could come in and air any grievance and they would all talk about it, so that the city really was all on the same page. There was a great amount of communication. The administration was very transparent in what they were doing, really counter to a lot of the rest of Ukrainian politics going on. And this model could then be presented to other groups, organizations, countries, being like, hey, look, we have something good going. We've laid a solid foundation. Like, your money is going to be safe here. And that really helped drive a lot of these connections. That said, Slavutych is really isolated in where it is. It's about a 3-hour bus ride from Kyiv. It's not the best bus ride. You can take multiple trains to get there as well through Chernihiv, which is just as slow, but maybe a little more comfortable. But even so, it's a little far out of the way. You have to intentionally go to Slavutych. You can't just stumble across it. And so part of these efforts of bringing money and people and events and culture to this town have to be very intentional in getting people to there. There has to be a solid reason to bring people there. It's not the capital. People aren't just there anyway, and you can throw different events at them to get them involved. There's a real effort and drive to make the city attractive for tourism, for other groups to come in. The demographics of the city are also very important in that it is a very young city, not just in terms of it's only been around for 30 years, but there's a large youth population there, younger than any city in Ukraine in terms of its demographic spread, and this has really helped drive a lot of these other connections, because this initial group of young people whose parents moved there or were moved to there to work at the plant are now in their mid to late 20s. They have gone off to school. They're bringing all of this expertise and knowledge back into the city, and so now really begins the second wave of transforming the city into its next iteration. In terms of state interventions, there haven't really been that many major investments by the state of Ukraine into the city. The special economic zone is the biggest one, but as I said before, the rest of the economic climate in Ukraine really didn't help the special economic zone in Slavutych work, because it was very hard to get money to Ukraine anyway. So the special economic zone really wasn't there. Also, initially, the city was getting funding from the Chernobyl ministry in the government, but as the government restructured itself over the past 30 years, there is no more Chernobyl ministry. It's been sort of absorbed by the Ministry of Emergency Response. And as the budgets continue to shrink, less and less money can be apportioned to the liquidation, and that means even less money can go to direct state investment in the city to help with services, infrastructure, things like that. So really, this is an example of the state not being able to serve this city that well, so the city having to go beyond it and forge its own connections. And which is why these non-state interventions are so important. By working directly with the UN and various UN agencies, and with a number of different NGOs, and with the IAEA, sort of bypassing the state and working directly with these organizations, they were able to, one, provide information and expertise, and on the back end receive direct help in the form of grants or money or development or other experts coming in to gauge the situation in the zone, to help figure out decommissioning the plant, and also with building the new Safe Confinement Center. A lot of these were driven by Slavutych rather than people in the federal government of Ukraine. More recently, they've been trying to attract more foreign investment into the city. There's plans to build a techno park. Udovichenko, who's still involved in the city's politics as a sort of a sub-governor, I guess, of the Kyiv Oblast. And in his view is that he really wants this to be like the Silicon Valley of Ukraine, because there's a lot of young people there. There's this idea of a startup culture that they've been trying to foster for decades now. And he feels like all they need is for just a couple businesses to start up, and then more will follow. I mean, it's a little pie in the sky, but that effort is there, that there's that vision is very telling, whereas in most other Ukrainian cities, you're not going to find that. In fact, there was just a large report sent out, sort of the results of a major nationwide survey in Ukraine about how people feel about their cities. And overwhelmingly, people are kind of dissatisfied with their cities. This report was just published a week or so ago. Vitaly posted it on Facebook. That's how I found it. But in sort of reaction to all of that, these big cities that people feel are going in the wrong direction, or there's not a lot of economic or political opportunity to express your views or whatever, Slavutych is a very open city. It's a very growing and vibrant city. And a big part of that is because of this grassroots action, because of this youth factor. This picture I put here on the bottom left is, there's one sort of movie theater entertainment building in Slavutych. And last year they had the 3rd annual 86 Film and Urbanism Festival, an international film festival where they had people come from all over, debuting films. They also had a short film competition for people in Ukraine. They're really trying to build this arts movement. When I was there last year, there was about 1,500 participants that came in, so which is a large fraction of the population of the town coming in, kind of overwhelmed it. They had to set up little tent cities in a lot of like the gymnasium, and it was a real fun atmosphere, having thousands of people, hundreds of people coming into this place, most of which had never been to Slavutych before. And a lot of the films were focused on sort of like the legacy of Chernobyl, and how to deal with that in terms of yourself, in terms of Ukraine, how it fits into, or how your identity as someone affected by Chernobyl fits into other global identities. And this year is the fourth annual one that's taking place in a couple weeks or so. And sort of the last thing that I want to talk about is the critical potential for this case. So I mentioned before that these Japanese delegations had come to look at Slavutych to see what happened and how they were able to rebound after a major technogenic disaster, or something that was caused by human intervention and technology. It's taken a long time, but the city has grown and developed, and it looks like it's on it's on track to grow and to become one of the most successful cities in Ukraine. So looking at this, I wrote down a number of sort of maybe extractable issues out of this case study. So one, what can you do when the state is weak and isn't giving you that much support, but your city needs help? What are you going to do? Especially if you're very small and there's not a lot of other industry that you can rely on. There's no large industrial sector. There's not a whole lot of people, so even like a retail or service market is going to be very small. How are you going to keep your city afloat? How are you going to keep your people employed and happy when there's not a lot of money coming in from the state? I think that's a very interesting question to look at this, maybe not as a model, but as one particular path or a set of things that are possible to do in these types of situations. Also looking at this bottom-up urbanism factor of the community participation in these democratic processes with the city council and the youth council, looking at just the administrative structure of the city and factoring in things like transparency, how much of that has affected the growth of the city versus any top-down type intervention. Also looking at Slavutych in relationship with urban sustainability discourse, which is a very broad topic that I'm not really that well read on, but I think there is a good argument to be made that Slavutych represents a different kind of urban sustainability than especially larger cities can engage in. And so the big question, though, is how exportable is this case? Because this city only came about because of a major nuclear disaster. Hopefully there won't be any more of those. But there are other types of disasters, not necessarily technogenic. There can be natural disasters. There can be political or other types of economic disasters. So how exportable is this case versus how unique is this case in looking at how cities develop and are able to incorporate and also bounce back from major things that happen to them? And that's it. So thank you. And I left some time for questions, so hopefully you have a few.
What's that picture?
Oh, this is, no, it's just some public art. So the building in the background is the city administration building. And on this side, so like behind me where I'm taking the picture, is the school. And so it's from like the schoolyard towards the city square and the main government building. Yeah.
I have a couple of just factual questions, sure. And thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I've never been to Slavutych in Ukraine. I've been all around, but it was super interesting.
Like I said, you have to intentionally go there. You're not just going to stumble across it.
Yeah. Okay, so one is, do you have any data or maybe just kind of word of mouth information about where these people, most of these people are employed? So what it is that they do in connection with the plant? Are they involved in, were they involved in the building of this containment structure? What are they doing now?
Yeah, many people were involved in the construction of the new Safe Confinement, and now that that's done, there is sort of a small vacuum now. But because that only happened a few months ago, and I haven't been back to talk to people about it, I haven't got a real sense of the issues there. But from what I gathered, because I'm a member of a number of different Facebook groups that are based in the city and talking about city development and what are we going to do kind of things, and there's a strong like branding element to it, like how are we going to present our city. It seems like the finishing of the construction of the NSC, while that did employ a number of people, it seems a lot of those were actually bussed in from other places to work on it. So there wasn't really that hard of a dip in unemployment, but also the NSC still requires upkeep and maintenance, which is also based in Slavutych. At the plant, any decommissioned power plant still needs constant monitoring. And so there's people that have been involved in that and are still involved in that. But a lot of people in the city are employed within the city in retail and services, things like that.
And the other question I had, so there's this kind of state-sponsored, partly state-sponsored identity that you can claim of being a Chernobylite, right? Mm-hmm. A Chernobyl survivor. And that includes getting financial benefits from the state and other benefits, like riding the transportation for free or something mm-hmm. like that. So are most of these people, do they have those rights? Do they have that identity? And to what extent that translates into how they view themselves? Because you say that they have turned it around and mm-hmm. put a positive spin on it. Yeah. To what extent do they identify as Chernobyls?
Most of the older generation are Chernobyls. But how they sort of incorporate that identity, I mean, on one level, it's individual, right? Some people were more devastated by it and never recovered. But other people, especially as the benefits have sort of run out, like the pension that you get, really isn't anything now. It's just a lot of the other benefits like free transportation, access to better hospitals, things like that. A lot of people still rely on those, but you have to usually go to Kyiv to receive any of those more specific benefits. But at the same time, I feel like, and this is sort of mirrored in the broader sort of like all Ukrainian Chernobyl identity, is that like, yes, this is this tragic thing that happened, but it's done now. And we need to move on past it. And I really feel like, especially among the youth, most of whose parents worked at the plant in some capacity, it's a part of their existence. They wouldn't be there without it. And it's not necessarily a hindrance. Some of them have been able to turn it into a benefit by sort of like using that cultural cachet to be like, yeah, I survived this thing and I'm okay and it's fine. And sort of using that like, I survived kind of thing to this survivor mentality that I can do anything, I can overcome any obstacle. And I feel like that's probably, especially among the youth, the overwhelming sort of feel that I got. But there are also other people that were significantly more hampered by it that are just sort of living and as best they can, kind of a thing.
Thank you.
So I had a similar question about employment. I'm curious about tourism. You indicated earlier that there's you'd have to cut through Belarus to get the most direct train route mm-hmm. to the plant. Only the workers can do that. It's really complicated for, say, someone from here to do that. So I'm guessing it's not a place that someone who wanted to go see the Chernobyl site, to see the wildlife, to see the old plant and city, it's not where they would like spend the night, right? They wouldn't go here. They would go somewhere else where there's a more direct route into the city, into the old plant.
Yeah, so this is the most direct route, where like a 50-kilometer train ride. Otherwise, if you wanted to drive a car, you'd have to go all the way around Kyiv Lake. Yeah. So if you are interested in Chernobyl tourism, a lot of times you start in Kyiv and you just go directly to the zone. There are a couple of hostels and hotels there that you can stay at that if you're in like a multi-day tour package, are sort of all wrapped up into that. But usually Slavutych is not part of those plans. The issue with that is most of these tour groups previously had been sort of like unsanctioned fly-by-night kind of operations in like a weird legal gray space. But now there's more of a concerted effort to increase tourism to the zone, especially in the past decade or so. There was a popular video game series that sparked a lot of attention to it. And so there is a lot of tourism, but it's mostly in this area here. So like the Red Forest, like I said, is down here. If you're interested in the ecology, you go directly to the area. But if you're interested more in like the social aspects, you have to make a separate trip to Slavutych.
So what are they doing to promote tourism? You mentioned that as a possible future revenue stream.
Well, the Film and Urbanism Festival is a big part of that, drawing in up to thousands of people now. And Udovichenko actually has a number of ideas in how to get that sorted. He wants there to be easier transportation for people between the zone and people in Slavutych, and then by extension from Chernihiv. And then he has other ideas like building a casino in the exclusion zone to sort of turn it from an economic drain into an economic producer. But all of these are sort of like really out there ideas. There's nothing really tangible about bridging the gap between these two things. I've met with a number of different tour guides that run Chernobyl tours, and only in a couple of them, if you take like the 3 or 5 day package, do you go to Slavutych. So in some of the longer ones, it is part of it. And when you read the literature for these groups, they mention Slavutych, but unless you're in one of the more expensive, longer packages, you're not going to go there. So a lot of that, I think they do have a lot of work in ramping up that the tourism connection there. And it would be a lot easier if they were able to relax some of these travel restrictions like on that rail line. Part of that issue, though, is that the rail line goes directly to the plant and not to the town of Chernobyl. Which causes a number of other issues, because then you're dropping a bunch of tourists off at basically a military zone, and that's protected by all these copyright type things, and also like when I visited there, you couldn't take pictures in certain angles, and so there's a lot higher control right around the plant rather than in the rest of the zone, and so they would have to come up with alternative transportation routes, maybe work with Belarus, which is the hard part, because then you have to, again, sort of make like change of visa regime basically in order to make travel easier, which might be too much to ask for a very small city.
Is the population pretty homogeneous? You had mentioned that there's really warm feelings and they're mostly from Chernobyl. They're pretty much the same ethnicity?
No, actually, the ethnic makeup of the city is pretty diverse. A lot of the construction people settled there, or maybe not a lot of, but a number of people did. And also because it's highly technical work at the plant, it attracted people that were working at other plants as well from all over the Soviet Union that had gone through the training to become a nuclear engineer. So there were a lot of families from all over the Union that ended up there. It's predominantly Ukrainian, though.
But they're fairly educated class. Mm-hmm. Do they have cultural things like dance and music?
Yeah. They have a number of different arts programs, especially for youth. They have a movie theater, which I was very surprised to see in a city of 25,000 people. They have 8 sports gymnasia that are free with your residency, and they're all really well-kept facilities. They have a local soccer team and a very big stadium, and yeah, they're really big on the having things to do, partly maybe because it's so isolated, but also because that's part of like this Soviet premier city. Like, this is everything we want it to be. We want to have all the options for people in this town, so they're all taken care of.
And it sounds because they're on the downwind, they're the upwind side of the plant. They didn't suffer much as far as health with cancer or anything like most people in Slovakia say, who a lot of people born in that generation have thyroid cancers, all kinds of things.
Well, there are a number of people that were that continue to work in the zone or were liquidators that have a number of health problems. But in terms of the construction of the city, it was just a real basic removing like the 15 centimeters of topsoil and then building, which at the time they figured this is enough, this is fine. But also interestingly, and I didn't mention this before, when they built the town, they only got a permit to remove the trees that they needed to remove. So a lot of the trees, for example, in the Central Park are original. They didn't demolish them because they wanted it to have sort of like an old growth feel to it. So.
I didn't notice many trees in your photos. I was thinking it was because it was such a young place that there weren't many trees that were taller than buildings. But you're saying that there were some.
Yeah, there are a number. Like maybe that's not the best example. Actually, on the title slide here, it's dark. But this is a monument that they built, and it's nighttime. But there are these very tall trees. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there a bicycle culture?
At the Film and Urbanism Festival, there were a lot of people on bikes, and they had actually organized like a major bike ride to there. So yes, but it seemed more of like a touristic thing. Yeah. Most people, I mean, the city's so small, you don't need a bike. You can walk everywhere in 10, 15 minutes. So, but there are a number of taxi services, which cracked me up because you don't need a taxi. But
Well, maybe for carrying stuff.
yeah, I suppose so. There's one grocery store, there's one restaurant, there are a couple other smaller cafes and productis, but it's very small.
I'm really, inspired by your story of bottom-up urbanism, but I share I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I share some skepticism, and I think that people probably are still getting a lot of state subsidies because of that.
I mean, I would imagine that there are, but I know like the only information you can actually get, unless you interview people and they feel comfortable enough telling you how much money they're getting from the state, which in my experience most people weren't, the only numbers you get are the official numbers coming out of the government. And when you look at the trend of those numbers, you're looking at a few hundred hryvnia a month, which is not very much. The exchange rate right now is around 25 to 1. So it's not that much money coming in. But you don't have other considerations like if you were given an apartment, you're not paying rent, things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of other benefits that are not.
Yeah, that are non-monetary. Yeah, non-monetary. Yeah.
Like education at the National University?
Yeah, I think that is a provision for Chernobyls. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But also, I'm pretty sure that if you go to a state university in Ukraine, if you're a Ukrainian citizen, it's free anyway.
Oh. And how about you said that a lot of these kids come back.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, don't want us the big city or?
Well, I think that's part of it, but part of it also really identify with being from this place, and that means something to them. That's where their community is. So I met a lot of people that have gone off to school all over the country or in Europe and come back. They might not be in town for very long. They're just staying for a week or two or over the summer, and then they go back to their jobs or to school or whatever, but they're always coming back and they're involved. And when they're not involved in person, they're involved online. There's a number of different groups and like youth organizations that are centered around either like building the startup culture or even just sort of like how to market this town either because of tourism or just to get it on the map so people know that it exists.
How is that identity affected? Because you talked about how this town was built to be like the pinnacle of like USSR, like building after Chernobyl. So in theory, they would have a really strong Ukrainian identity, but it's also built upon like international investment and international business and like startup. So do they like consider themselves really nationalist Ukrainians, or are they more looking towards the West, westernizing themselves?
Well, they're definitely westward looking, especially because that's where all the investment money is coming in. And a lot of the young people are educated in the West. In Western Europe, in the United States, most people there of my generation speak English. And so it was very easy and comfortable for foreigners, for Americans to go and be there. You're always going to find people to talk to. Even if you don't speak any of the language and you find yourself in the middle of nowhere here, people will be able to help you out, translate for you, get you where you need to go. There is an idea of like we are Ukrainian, but in sort of like how that identity is constructed, some people are going to feel more, like they're going to identify more with their local identity rather than their national identity. And I think that's the main driver, is that you're from this place and this city means something. Yes, you're Ukrainian and you speak Ukrainian, and it's fine and good, and that means something too. But what's more important is their local identity.
Do you think if the population size was like significantly larger, would that affect that kind of feeling to more towards nationalists instead of like localized identity?
I don't know necessarily if it would go more nationalist, just given the political climate in Ukraine right now. But as in any case, once you increase the number of people, the diversity of people also increases, especially in terms of identity and political views. So, I mean, yeah, so when you increase the number of people, different identity constructions are going to come out, certainly.
I guess that's what's very interesting because, like you said, they weren't just Ukrainians. They were people coming from all sorts of walks of life, and then they've like developed like this very localized identity.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
How do you get its name?
Slavutych? That is an old name for the Dnieper, I think. Is that right? Yeah. It's also the name of a brewery that also got its name from the river as well. Yeah.
And what about the radium that used to be there? I mean, did that get all removed during the Soviet times, or?
Well, so a lot of the stuff from the initial blast all went west, and because this is in the east, just by clearing that topsoil.
You know, to operate the plant, you know, they need a certain amount of radioactive materials.
Oh yeah, where they get it from? They had a deal with Westinghouse to deliver material. So again, some more Western involvement there. But in terms of there being any in the town, all that stays in the plant and in the exclusion zone.
And I mean, we have a lot of problems too. But where do you put all that radioactive stuff that's going to?
That's a big question, and the biggest question of that question is money. Yeah. Like, how do you build a safe place to store all that, and where are you going to get all the money for it? So it's not just siting, but also who's going to pay for it, because the Ukrainian government doesn't have the money to pay for a long-term storage facility. And there's a lot of sites in the exclusion zone where there's just, maybe not like radioactive material, but irradiated or radiologically contaminated material that's just dumped in these big like graveyards or junkyards of just stuff that's highly radioactive, but just sort of out of the way enough where you're never going to go to it. And the Speckombinat that runs Chernobyl knows where they are, but they don't publicize that information.
And you feel safe being there?
Oh, yeah.
Your little Geiger counter.
Well, in Slavutych, you don't even need it. It's fine. It's like any other city in Ukraine. But even in the zone, when you go there, like, there's higher background radiation, but if you're there for a few days, it's fine. I think someone said 24 hours in the zone is the equivalent of a transatlantic flight in the radiation you get. So.
Say nothing about going to Mars.